Okay, so this is Deborah. My name's Richard. Obviously, we're going to do the Manhattan Project, and I'm going to be doing um, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Sorry, and it was there somewhere. But we're going to start off with the Manhattan Project. So, um, basically, can you tell me what happened during the Manhattan Project? What discovery spurred the development of the atomic bomb?
The discovery of fission. So in 1939, American scientists took steps to organize a project to exploit the newly recognized fission process for military purposes. If everybody doesn't know, nuclear fission is the subdivision of an heavy atomic nucleus, such as the uranium or plutonium, into two fragments of roughly the equal size mass. The process is accompanied by the release of a large amount of energy. In nuclear fission, the nucleus of an atom breaks up into two lighter nuclei. The process may take place spontaneously in some cases, or may be induced by the excitation of the nucleus of a variety of particles, like a neutron, a proton, or an alpha particle, or with electromagnetic radiation in the form of gamma rays.
Oh, okay.
In the fission process, a large quantity of energy is released, radioactive products are formed, and several neutrons are emitted.
Okay.
These neutrons can induce fission in the nearby nucleus of fissionable material and release more neutrons that cause repeated the sequence, causing a large chain reaction.
Okay. So just boom.
Yeah.
Okay. So my next question for you is, how was the project developed?
Well, in the summer of 1939, Albert Einstein was persuaded by his fellow scientists to influence the military to create a program that could potentially use the uncontrolled fission reaction. And he spoke to President Roosevelt.
Okay.
So in February of 1940, $6,000. Can you imagine? Only $6,000 was available to start the research. And then on December 6, 1941, the project was put under the direction of the Office of Scientific Research and Development.
Okay.
After the U.S. entered World War II, they brought in the War Department to give joint responsibilities. And the construction of sites fell underneath the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Oh, okay. So why was it called the Manhattan Project?
Well, the Manhattan Project was a large research effort that took place after we joined the war. So in June of 1942, the Corps of Engineers Manhattan District was put in charge of the construction work of the site. So the project was named after Manhattan because of the research conducted at the Columbia University in Manhattan.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, at the time, it was one of the largest techno-science projects in history, costing over $2 billion for the time. I wonder what that would be these days.
Right. Right. Oh, I'm sure it's in the billions. What, 100 billions?
100 billions, yeah.
Okay. So tell me about the different Manhattan Project sites and why were there so many?
If the project to build the bomb would be achieved timely, there were several lines of research and development that had to be carried out simultaneously. So the explosion material then had to be produced and be suitable for use on an actual weapon. The United States was in direct competition with Germany to develop the bomb before, one of the other ones did.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So for the first site was developed to work with the uranium-235, the fissionable material uranium-235, which is an essential component for the atomic bomb. So uranium-238 or uranium-230 cannot be separated from its natural companion uranium-238 by the chemical means. The atoms of these isotopes are separated from each other by physical means.
Oh, like enriching it, basically.
Mm-hmm. So they tested several different methods, and then two were chosen: the electromagnetic process and diffusion process. Both the processes required large, complex facilities and huge amounts of electricity.
Wow. Okay.
So these methods were put into production at a 70 square mile tract near Knoxville, Tennessee. This was originally known as Clinton Engineer Works and then later called Oak Ridge. Another site produced the fissionable material plutonium-239. This was developed originally at a laboratory in the University of Chicago and involved the transmutation in a reactor pile of uranium-238. So in December of 1942, scientists finally succeeded in producing and controlling a fission reaction in this reactor pile in Chicago.
Okay.
So quantity productions of plutonium-239 required the construction of a reactor a great size and power that would release about 25,000 kilowatts of heat for each gram of plutonium produced.
Oh, okay.
And the bomb needed a lot of plutonium.
Right. Which is why it's so huge, so big as it is.
So these large-scale production reactors were built on an isolated 1,000 square mile tract of the Columbia River north of Pasco, Washington. This site called Hannaford Engineer Works. But to talk about the final site, Los Alamos, we must talk about Robert J. Oppenheimer.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. J. Robert Oppenheimer. His first name was Julius.
Oh, okay.
Or his friends like to refer to him as Oppie.
Oppie.
Oppie. Robert Oppenheimer was an American theoretical physicist. Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory and responsible for research and design of the atomic bomb. He was also known as the father of the atomic bomb.
So what happened in his life?
Well, Oppenheimer is a little bit of misconception. Everybody thinks he might have been German or whatnot. But he was actually born in April 22nd, 1904 in New York.
Okay. His name does sound German.
Yeah. He was, obviously. And by the age of 10, Oppenheimer was studying minerals, physics, and chemistry.
Okay.
Funny little story about him. But because of his correspondence with the New York Mineralogy Club, so advanced, they thought he was older, and they invited him to deliver a lecture, not realizing he was a 12-year-old boy.
Oh. All right.
I mean, my 10-year-old.
It's pretty smart.
Mm-hmm. So then he graduated as valedictorian of his high school class in 1921, but then he fell ill with a near-fatal case of dysentery and was forced to postpone enrolling at Harvard.
Oh, wow. Okay.
After being bedridden for months, his parents arranged for him to spend time in New Mexico in 1920.
Okay.
This becomes important later on, finding the
Los
site.
Alamos.
Los Alamos.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So Robert stayed at a dude ranch 25 miles northeast of Santa Fe. From there, he took 5-6 day horseback trips going out into the field and the mountains of, New Mexico, Santa Fe, which is gorgeous. I love Santa Fe. And so that really kind of instilled a passion for the area, and he really, really deeply fell in love with it. So once Oppenheimer was better, he enrolled in Harvard in September of 1922.
Oh, he did make it. Okay.
He did make it. And it took him 3 years to graduate.
Damn.
He majored in chemistry.
Someone had no kids. Okay.
Right. Oh, don't we know? Kids make things hard. Oppenheimer did eventually realize his true passion. So, he majored in chemistry, but his true passion was the study of physics.
Okay.
So once he realized his true passion of physics, in 1925, Oppenheimer began his graduate work in physics at Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, England.
Okay. So he traveled overseas then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. At Cavendish, Oppenheimer realized that his talents were for theoretical, not experimental physics.
Oh, okay.
So he was kind of a clumsy kid, like a young man at the point.
Right.
So he was known to knock over beakers and experiments within the lab.
Out of nervousness, probably? Or?
I don't know. No, but he was very clumsy. So one of his professors suggested that he go study underneath a theoretical physicist by the name of Max Born, who was the director of the Institute of Theoretical Physics at the University of Göttingen, to study in Germany.
Okay.
So once he received his doctorate in 1927, he accepted a professorship at University of California, Berkeley.
So he went to Harvard in 22, and by 1927, he was already a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, professor. Shit. So he...
wow.
Yes,
okay.
So he taught at the University of Berkeley the California Institute of Technology. And one of the main reasons he accepted this job is because it put him closer to New Mexico.
Okay.
So while he was working at Berkeley, he was approached by Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves to direct the building of the atomic bomb for theoretical to physical. So by the time the Manhattan Project was launched in the fall of 1942,
Right.
Oppenheimer had already built the reputation of being involved in exploration of possibility of the atomic bomb. He had already been studying it.
Theoretically.
So, throughout the previous year, he had been doing research on fast neutrons, counting how much material might be needed for a bomb and how efficient it might be.
Okay.
So although Oppenheimer had little managerial experience, which was a little bit of a concern when taking over a very large
You're so
project.
young.
Yep. He also had past associations as a communist.
Okay.
So
big thing back then.
Yeah, if you think back then, like being a communist was not good. His brother was a part of the Communist Party. He had a girlfriend that was part of the Communist Party, and then his wife, previous party.
Right.
So
I think the saying back then was like better dead than red.
Yeah.
From that time.
Yeah.
I recall.
Yeah. So
I'm from that time. I've heard that somewhere in my life.
That might have come from then.
That might come from then. Yeah.
But this General Leslie Groves recognized his exceptional brilliance in physics.
Okay.
So on July 20th, 1943, Oppenheimer had an issue of getting his security clearance because of his left political views. So the director, or the General Leslie Groves, on July 20th, he directed that he receive his security clearance without delay because he was absolutely essential to the party.
So he saw something in him that like a lot of people didn't, which is probably a good thing because, he helped atomic bomb.
So he was having issues. They dead stopped his security clearance. They would not let him get through. So the general had to take it up and be like, nope, he gets clearance and he gets it now.
It's always helpful to have somebody higher up to kind of vouch for you, but like in a good way, obviously.
Yeah. So when Oppenheimer took over the project of building the bomb, he suggested a laboratory in New Mexico that he knew well. So it was the area he was exploring when he was sick in 1922. This laboratory is located near Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a site of a private boys' school called the Los Alamos Ranch School.
Okay.
So along with those school buildings, they took over those buildings, and then they had to add more because when the laboratory opened, there were only a few scientists, but then those scientists grew.
Okay.
More.
Let me
thank you. More scientists came in, and then the scientists, they wanted scientists to stay, so they invited their families.
That makes sense.
They had families, and they had to have general stores and all kinds of things. So this laboratory grew from just a couple hundred people to over 6,000 people.
Wow. Yeah, definitely want more buildings with that many people. Cafeteria, probably.
Somewhere to eat, yes. So at this point in the war, there was considerable anxiety against the Germans' nuclear weapons program. So they were afraid that the Germans were going to get there before they did. So that they kind of amped up the Manhattan Project to get things to work. So in 1943, they discovered they built the plutonium gun-typed fission weapon.
Oh, okay.
So this was initial research. The properties of plutonium was done using a cyclotron, and which generated plutonium-239, which was extremely pure, but could be created only in tiny amounts. So plutonium-239 was being built at the Hanford plant.
Down in Washington. Okay.
So I watched the movie Oppenheimer, and he used a visual aid of like how much they needed. And so there was a big old bowl and then a smaller bowl, and they say they needed this much uranium and this much plutonium, and you used marbles.
Okay.
And when they had enough of the plutonium and uranium, he would drop them into the bowls, and as soon as the bowls were filled, excuse me. Anyway, so as they were building
the bowls with the marbles.
Bowls, they were filling up these bowls and saying they had this much uranium, this much plutonium, and so when those got full, then they could start building the actual bomb. But there was a problem. So when the sample of plutonium actually reached Los Alamos in April of 1944. The purebred plutonium that they were creating and building was a higher concentration than what they had been working with on the gun type weapon.
Oh, okay.
So they had to pivot.
Right.
So in July of 1944, Oppenheimer abandoned the gun design in favor of an implosion type weapon, which we know is now the bomb. By using, they did this by using chemical explosive lenses and smaller amounts of fissionable material in denser form.
Right.
So
Okay.
they just combined it. This process required the metal to travel only a short distance, which means the crucial mass can be assembled much more quickly. Which in building weapons,
because you're putting so many pieces together, condensing it.
Yeah. So in February of 1945, after a mammoth research effort, the more complex design of the implosion device, known as the Christie gadget, finalized in a meeting in Oppenheimer's office on February 28th, 1945.
Okay. February 28th, 1945. Wow. Okay.
So, as we know now, the war is almost over at this point.
Right.
So then this led to the very first bomb named Trinity. So
what was Trinity then?
Trinity, Oppenheimer called the site Trinity. Well, so the site was called Trinity. I don't know if
the site was called Trinity.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if the bomb was called Trinity. So the first atomic bomb was exploded at 5:30 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They had to move the site farther away from Los Alamos because Los Alamos was located in kind of a canyon with lots of hills.
Wow.
And then from testing that they had done, they realized that they needed a lot more space.
So the first site was Albuquerque.
Not Albuquerque, I'm sorry, Santa Fe.
Santa Fe.
So then the actual explosion of the bomb was moved to just south of Albuquerque.
Wow. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah.
At all. I would have thought Los Alamos
would have been fine. But it's very mountainous up in Santa Fe.
Oh wow. Okay.
So in order to set this bomb off, they built a tower, a 100-foot steel tower that was designated as zero, up in the air, the 100 feet. And then the area below was termed ground zero, which is where the term came for ground zero, which is usually
that makes sense.
Described as often catastrophic event. Yep.
So which in this case, of course,
So that's where ground zero came from. So all of the scientists and everybody who came out to watch, and all the military men who came out to watch the bomb, they were 10,000 yards away.
Okay.
10,000. Okay. Yeah, and they all had the special glasses to protect their glasses from the radiation.
Which makes sense.
So once they dropped the bomb, the explosion was intense light flash, a sudden wave of heat, and a tremendous shock wave that just roared over everybody. Wow. And then once the bomb exploded, a massive ball of fire went 40,000 feet up into the air, which is the mushroom cloud that we see.
Right.
And the bomb generated an explosive power equivalent to 15,000 to 20,000 tons of TNT.
Right. Okay.
The tower was completely vaporized. The surrounding desert surface fused to glass from a radius of 800 yards.
Damn.
Yep. So that was the very first bomb.
Okay.
And so what happened after the first bomb?
So what happened afterwards was obviously by sometime around August, the military, as it always does, got involved. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to use these bombs against Japan. And the reason against Japan, why they wanted to use like the atomic bomb against them, is because they noticed that the Japanese were not going to willfully surrender the way the Germans had put like their arms down once Hitler died and that kind of thing. Right. So they figured the only way to actually get them to surrender, because the Japanese, proud people, they were going to fight to the end. Right. They were going to fight until, the last man standing.
They weren't giving up.
Right, exactly. They weren't giving up at all. And so because of that, because they weren't giving up at all, the military decided to go ahead and drop these atomic bombs on top of 2 different cities, different locations, but ultimately they ended up choosing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And
do you know why they chose those sites?
The reason they chose them was for strategic reasons. Hiroshima, they chose that one because it was the defense of all of southern Japan, and it also housed the Second Army headquarters for Japan. Obviously, that's a huge thing.
Okay, so it was one of the big hubs.
Right, it was like a
military.
big personnel, probably training, that kind of thing. I mean, Second Army headquarters, you're just behind the First Army, so I mean, you're still, you're right up there as far as like the front lines and that kind of thing go. So they decided to go ahead and use that as a strategic, place to drop a bomb. The second place they chose, which was 3 days later from the first one, and I'll get into that right now, but in a little bit. They chose Nagasaki again because Nagasaki was a town right on the edge of a long waterfront, kind of like a seaport town. And so the strategic thing about that was that they had a lot of military industrial industries there. They had ordinances, they had ships.
And we know a lot of good services come through
Right.
water and ship.
Exactly, especially during that time. The plane had only been around for a couple of decades, maybe a few decades, if that. So it wasn't like things were getting delivered by plane. In fact, a lot of the military, when they got to Europe and Japan, they had to go by boat. It wasn't like they were delivered, dropped off kind of thing, unless they were paratroopers. Right. But so they chose Nagasaki because it was a seaport village area. And the thing about Nagasaki is that it is between two big mountain ranges. And because it's between two mountain ranges, when the bomb went off, it kind of contained some of the fallout because those mountain ranges held it in.
Okay.
So instead of it like dispersing in the air and that kind of thing, it just
it was a mass
casualty. It was mass casualty, but a little more localized than, say, Hiroshima, because Hiroshima didn't have all that. So because they didn't have all that, you had a lot of fallout. Some of the things that you had were like black rain happen, which is basically raining down, nuclear activity that created like clouds. You also had what happened was you also had radioactive material that was left over from bombs, causing other things that were radioactive to become suddenly radioactive because of the interactions between of those radioisotopes that were used, the uranium and the plutonium. So they would obviously interact with other things, other atoms, and they would interact with that nucleus, and suddenly they'd cause that nucleus to become radioactive, unstable, and then boom, that thing becomes radioactive itself. Okay. The good thing, though, I mean, not that it was a good thing to drop bombs, but I mean, if you're an American, of course it was. Which it benefited us. It stopped Japan ended up surrendering day after.
Essentially the end of it.
Right, they surrendered a day after, right after. But the good thing about those bombs being dropped were that they didn't impact upon like hitting the ground. They impacted above like the cities. So it wasn't like the bomb fell and then hit the ground and then exploded.
Right.
It was the bomb fell. It was 1,000 feet in the air, and then it exploded.
So Oppenheimer had designed it so that it would explode in the air.
Right. The first bomb, which was the one in Hiroshima, because that one was dropped on August 6th, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., and that was by a B-29 plane. And that plane, if you ever seen a B-29, it just has propellers. So there was no jet engine. There was no jet engine. I mean, it was as fast as the propeller would take it. So with that first one,
I know one of the concerns when building it was how fast could the plane get away.
Right. The first one, it actually didn't get too far from where one bomb exploded. It actually got to see some of the bomb and felt probably some of the concussion waves that happened after an explosion that catastrophic. But that first bomb was a type bomb, which is exactly what you were talking about. How it uses a uranium core, which was equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT being used. But what it does is it uses a primer that core at a certain speed, and once it hits
Oh.
that core at a certain speed, it causes it to go radioactive, unstable, and
Mhm.
then it explodes.
Okay,
So that was the
that makes
first bomb
sense
in
why they call
Hiroshima.
it a gun type.
Yeah, hence the gun assembly
Yeah.
type. The second one in Nagasaki was actually a an implosion type, the fission type, like
Mhm.
the more intricate one, and that one used like a it used basically a plutonium core, and that plutonium was surrounded by uranium. And when the uranium got activated by an activator, which is probably why when you look at like the atomic bombs, you see all those wires going in.
Mhm.
So those wires they cause like an electrical charge to the outer part of the it's the inner but outer part of the bomb. So you have the shell, then you have an inner layer, and then you have the plutonium core in the middle.
Mhm.
That so that inner layer that's surrounding that core, well, is what gets electrified, and once that gets electrified, it like causes the plutonium to become unstable, and then you have an implosion because it's coming from the
Mhm.
inside of the bomb outward.
Right, and then it
So,
creates that
and
chain
it creates that
reaction.
chain reaction.
Mhm.
Yep. And so, it, again, it creates that chain reaction, that big flash that you see, then the plume of smoke. Yeah, everything that you can imagine with an explosive size that nature, the concussion, the
Yeah,
heat.
seeing that.
Um, yeah. So what happened basically was the short-term effects on people who were in either of these cities. The buildings, they were reinforced. They were the only things reinforced at the time. They were made of concrete. They were made of reinforced concrete. However, their homes were made of wood
Mhm.
and brush and stuff that they could find like, from the surrounding area. They weren't like, you know, stucco frame, that kind of thing. Now,
Right.
this kind of thing.
But then what we
So
know
they
from our
easily burned, basically.
yeah, it's what we know from our learning here at school is that that concrete kind of helps that barrier from radiation.
Right. So like, yeah, exactly. That kind of helped a little bit some of those, but it doesn't help as far as like those concussion
Mhm.
waves, the explosion, kind of
Mhm.
knocking them all down.
Yeah.
And nowadays, in the center city of I believe it's Hiroshima, they have like the church where the bomb exploded just right above an air, and it's part of the museum that you can go to. And the nice thing about going nowadays is that a lot of the radioactive decay, because you think that it's still radioactive area and that
Mhm.
kind of thing, is actually
Not anymore.
not significant enough to cause harm, not
Mhm.
significant enough to continue to cause harm in people.
Mhm.
But at the time of the explosion, people were instantly vaporized. Some
Mhm.
people. Sadly, it happened mostly to little kids
Mhm.
because, as we learned, younger tissue and were the most sensitive,
Right.
and they were vaporized instantly, and what they call like a flash burn.
Mhm.
And they actually have like a wall in that museum I was telling you about where you can actually see where people were like flash right into the wall, their
Wow.
silhouette, which is pretty sad.
Wow.
Um, yeah, hence the reason why like it's sad and a good thing. You know, sad
Yeah.
because the people had to suffer such a huge catastrophic event, but good because we got out of the war. It finally ended, like the fight with Japan.
Mhm.
So, which was super important for our survival at the time.
Mhm.
Um, but so again, the easily the the short term effects are instantly flash burns. What they called what they called oh my god keloids, which is basically a re-scarring that
Mhm.
happens on your skin,
Yep.
and it basically protrudes upward, and then it like black and stays that way because of the flash burn that happens to your
Okay.
skin.
So if you had keloids.
You had keloids, you had cataracts
Mhm.
happen, within a few years, kind of thing. Um, uh, well, with these actually,
Mhm.
because it was more deterministic effect than it is stochastic. Okay, just to recap, because of whatever technical difficulties we were having, entire families were destroyed in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And unfortunately, the location of people in proximity to the detonation site were those that suffered more than those that were further out. And sadly enough, women were the most affected compared to men, and children were the most at risk of short and long term effects because of their age. However, if you were in utero at the time of the attack, at the time of the bombing, you'd have a much lower cancer rate than those that were outside of utero, basically living, breathing, walking, talking. Um, you had a much lower cancer rate comparably just by being in utero, which seems kind of shocking. But some of the deterministic effects at the time of the bombing were they noticed that people ended up getting cataracts along with calloids. And if you don't know what calloids is raised scarring that occurs on the skin. It turns black. It kind of seems to stay permanently. Another thing that happened was anemia among the people who did survive. And of course, there was huge discrimination and stigma that was associated amongst the survivors by those that were not part of the bombings. Later on, the stochastic effects, they found that leukemia didn't appear until 2 years after the initial drop, meaning the initial bombing, and peaked around 4 to 6 years later. After about that time, the Japanese government found that the average lifespan, because of the bombing, was reduced by about 1 to 3 years. And for some people, it was even just by a few months compared to those that were not exposed to the radiation as fallout. Um, However, if you were a survivor of the bombing and you ended up getting leukemia, your risk for getting leukemia was 46% higher just by surviving the bombings themselves compared to those that were unexposed to any of the bombings. Um, Sadly, again, some of the long term effects were you developed leukemia, you also developed thyroid cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer. And because of all these cancers developing, the Japanese government actually ended up starting a tumor registry for both cities of the survivors of those cities after the attack, after the bombing. Um, in 1994, there was a study done that actually studied the people who were exposed to the bombings radiation before birth, meaning in utero at the time, and they found that the genetic mutations that had occurred amongst those people, if there were any noticeable ones, was them having a smaller head size, some mental disability and impairment, and also physical growth suffered as a result. There was a comprehensive study done in 2003 by Dale L. Preston, and he actually found that cancer risk was not more than 5 times compared to those that were unexposed individuals. And as of today, um, radioactivity in Nagasaki and Hiroshima is so low that it's barely distinguishable using detecting methods like a Geiger counter. Um, the good thing about the bomb exploding the way that it did was that it exploded high in the atmosphere. So, because it didn't hit the ground per se, this apparently led to the fact that the radioactivity decayed within a few days of the explosion compared to taking years or thousands of years to kind of fall by the wayside. Um, and actually, during the 1950s and 60s, radioactive atmospheric tests were done, and these tests were done to measure the amount of fallout that had occurred because of the wind blowing this radioactive material around within the air. Um, and just as a quick last fact, the effects of the bomb, of both bombs dropping, were
hugely beneficial for America, not to mention the war going on at the time, because within a day, the Japanese government ended up accepting the terms of surrender, which was known as the Potsdam Declaration. Um, and that's pretty much Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a nutshell. Um, like I said earlier in the podcast, it's very much looking back in history. It's a very much a sad thing that it had to be done, but the Japanese were willing to fight to the last man, and they're just a proud people. And because they're a proud people, it's very unfortunate that it came to having to bomb two cities with an immense amount of radiation in order to have them, accept our terms of surrender. Thank you for coming to this podcast, for listening to this podcast.